Well, good morning and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar. My name is Oliver Hartwig, and today we are here to celebrate and introduce our latest report. It's called Trade Routes by our colleague Michael Johnston with a foreword from Josh Williams. And I'm delighted that we'll have both Michael and Josh on this call. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you, Oliver.
I should mention that we launched this report to the public yesterday. It got a lot of media coverage. You might have seen some of that, and Michael was on Mike Hosking's breakfast program, but also on RNZ. We then had a formal launch event in Auckland last night with the acting Prime Minister in the room, David Seymour, and also Penny Simmons, the Minister in charge of the tertiary system. That is not university because that's Shane Retty. But today what we want to do is we want to go into more of the details of the report and discuss it. And for those of you who have been with us on previous webinars, you know the drill. We'll hear from the author, we will have expert commentary from Josh Williams, and then afterwards we'll open up to your discussions, your questions in a discussion. The way to participate in this is very simple. You just have to log on to slido.com and put in the code. The code is 3762639. I will also mention it again over the webinar. And I will then ask the most popular questions, because that's a wonderful feature of Slido. You can't just ask your own questions, you can also vote on everybody else's questions. So we will try to answer the most popular ones. But anyway, before we get to that, of course, we want to hear from the author of the report. And by the way, this is the report. You can read it, find it on our website free of charge. It's called Trade Routes, Charting New Pathways from Secondary School to Industry Training. The author, as I mentioned, is Michael Johnston, and probably doesn't need much of an introduction because he's well known. He's written many publications for the initiative over the last few years. But just for background, Michael leads our education work here at the initiative. He is a cognitive psychologist by background. He has a background in literacy research, educational assessment, and psychometrics. And before he joined us at the initiative, he was the Associate Dean Academic of the Faculty of Education here at Victoria University in Wellington. And Michael, of course, also last year chaired the Ministerial Advisory Group for Education, Minister Erica Stanford. And after Michael, we'll hear from Josh Williams, and he is the head of consulting at Skills Group and a director of the Master Academy supporting training and apprenticeships in the marine and composites industries. He's also linked to the Global Apprenticeship Network, which means he knows a lot about the apprenticeship schemes going on all around the world. And Josh leads a team providing research, insights, and consultancy services on workforce and skills issues. And previously, he was the chief executive of the Industry Training Federation of New Zealand and a senior policy manager at the New Zealand Ministry of Education. So he really knows what he's talking about. So we look forward to your comments too, Josh. But to kick us off today, we'll of course hear from the author of a report, Trade Routes, and that's Michael Johnston. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And Josh, thank you for being here. It's I was very grateful for the lovely foreword you wrote, and also for the great conversations we had while I was writing the report. It was a bit of a new departure for me, and your expertise was greatly appreciated. But I might start by observing that every year some 65,000 young New Zealanders leave school. Now, of that 65,000, about a third go to university. Only 6% go into apprenticeships. So we have a huge disparity in university attendance and the uptake of apprenticeships. And as a further observation, some 11% become unemployed. So there's huge room for us to improve the uptake, and I would say the quality of the apprenticeship experience in New Zealand. And I think Josh and I were both inspired last year when we visited Germany with the New Zealand German Chamber of Commerce to study their dual training system, where about half of German school leavers go into apprenticeships. So there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from Germany. And I would say that there are kind of two overarching issues that we have. One is cultural. We just don't esteem apprenticeships and the trades very highly in New Zealand. And so university is seen as the destination of choice by a lot of young New Zealanders and their parents. And I think a lot of them end up there kind of by accident, when perhaps an apprenticeship would have suited some of them better. So I think we need to make apprenticeships much more visible to school students. And that connects to the second issue, which I think is a lack of system coherence. There are some great initiatives at the secondary school level, under the banner of Youth Guarantee to promote and fund various aspects of trades track or vocational pathway training, but they're not joined up. And by that I mean they have separate systems of funding and they have different eligibility criteria. So one of the big things I think we need to do is to bring those together into one single coherent pathway that's actually much more available to all. Another issue is that many of these schemes are capped. And on the cultural side, what that leads to is the use of these pathways mostly for students who are seen as not coping very well with the mainstream academic path. And that's the wrong way to think about it. We really should be thinking about the university track and the trades track as equal partners for young people's destinations post-school, and doing all we can to promote the vocational pathway so that in time it will develop better status alongside that university track. But I think bringing together those youth guarantee measures into a single package, which actually forms the core of a full work integrated learning pathway into apprenticeships and other kinds of trades training, would be extremely valuable. Now, last night I did launch the report at one of New Zealand's new charter schools, the Busy School, which is the first New Zealand campus of Busy School, which is a Queensland operation. And they really illustrate the way in which senior school vocational track pathways should look. That is, they have flexible timetables so that students can easily attend either a tertiary institution or a workplace for work integrated learning. They concentrate on getting them work ready and then supporting them when they're in the workplace learning there. And they've had great success in turning around students who have been disengaged from learning. But again, I think we need to cast the net much more widely and consider all students have the potential to choose a vocational or apprenticeship pathway. So one of the things that I think we need to think about longer term, and this is a long-term thing because it would require rethinking the way in which the school system is organised to an extent, is the ability for schools to specialise from about year 11 or year 12 on either an apprenticeship track or trades training track or a university track. And the reason for that is that I think it's very difficult within the resources of a school to do full justice to both. Part of that is the timetabling issues, part of it is the staffing issues. If you've got a full cadre of teachers teaching curriculum subjects, which are largely derived from university disciplines, then it's going to be difficult to afford the staff you might need to do full justice to a vocational pathway as well. So those are some of the things that I think we can do at school level, but there are also things to look at beyond school. So one of the things that I've recommended in the report is that we have a look at the way apprentices are paid. And this was inspired by something that the Germans do. So in New Zealand, apprentices are paid at the same rate throughout their study, whereas the Germans have a graduated system of pay for them. So they get paid quite a low rate at first, and each year they get an increment. Now, this makes it lower risk for employers to take on apprentices because they're not paying them as much at first, but as they become more productive and of more value to the employer, they pay them more. And another thing that I think would be worth thinking about is a bonding system whereby apprentices could opt to be paid more in return for signing a bond that would commit them to work for their employer for, say, 2 or 3 years after they graduate. And that's so that employers have some assurance that a really good apprentice won't just graduate and then go off and get a job somewhere else. Now, that bonding system, if an apprentice or a graduate defaulted on the bond, could be underwritten by the IRD so that it was smooth for the employer. And then the bond could be repaid through the tax system, much as student loans are at the moment. Now, speaking of student loans and student funding in general, I think another thing that we need to do is to give stronger incentives for young people to consider trades training and apprenticeships rather than university necessarily. And one way that we could do that is with the current fees-free funding, move most of it from the university system to trades training. If we think about, and trades and industry training, I should say, if we think about 30% of young people going to university and they all have a fees-free year, that funding could make 3 years of training free for 6% or even 12%. So we could do a lot with that. And actually, there's no evidence that the fees-free year has increased university participation anyway. A caveat on that is that I'd probably want to means test it rather than throw it out altogether, because I wouldn't like to put any barriers in the way of young people from backgrounds who haven't been well represented at university in the past. So that's kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, Māori and Pacifica and the like. So then the final thing that I'll mention is our workforce development councils. They're possibly the closest counterpart we have in New Zealand to the German Chambers of Commerce. And I would say the chambers in Germany are the glue that holds their whole system together. Our workforce development councils are currently undergoing review and will soon be known as industry skills boards. And I think this gives us a real opportunity to set up them to be more like the German Chambers of Commerce than they have been in the past. So in the past, I see two issues with the workforce development councils. One is that they have insufficient scope to really make a strong difference. They're primarily just responsible for standard setting. And the other is that they're not accountable to industry because they're ministerially appointed. So I would like to see the industry skills boards elected by industry associations rather than appointed by ministers, to give them that accountability back to industry and to make sure that whatever is being trained is right for industry. And in that regard, I'd like to see their scope increase so they have some more influence, so that they can use their skills and their knowledge to improve the quality of training programs. So at the moment, as I said, they're responsible for standard setting. I'd like to see that expanded to give them final approval for programs and qualifications. And critically, also at the secondary level, I'd like to see it written into their charters that they have responsibility for approving those programs as well, and for supporting secondary schools to develop them. Because I think that would make a huge difference and start to give us a really connected up system if those industry experts could be overseeing both secondary and tertiary programs and the pathways between them. You know, I was inspired last night by Josh's colleague, Arthur Graves, who said that what we need to think beyond a system that has transitions from secondary to tertiary, and think more in terms of a progression. And what that might look like is young people starting some work integrated learning while they're at school and having a dual enrolment, perhaps with a tertiary institution. And then at some point that turns into an apprenticeship. And maybe the school stays in the picture for a while to help them with their life skills and their workforce readiness and that kind of thing. And then at a certain point, the school lets them go because now they're ready. So if we thought in terms of less abrupt transitions from school to tertiary and work, and more of Arthur's idea of a progression, where we just gave each young person what they needed to launch them into their lives, I think that would go a long way. So those are some of the top level recommendations in the report, and I'll hand over to Josh for his comment on them.
Thank you very much, Michael. And before we go to Josh, just a reminder, you can give us your questions on Slido, and the code is 3762639. I put it in the notes as well, and the questions are rolling in. We've got 19 already, so please keep them coming. But now over to Josh, who's written a wonderful foreword for the report. Thanks again for that great foreword. And now we'd like to hear your observations on the issues at hand.
Thank you. Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I don't know how this happened, but Michael, I think the bullet points you've just run through are the same as the bullet points I've written for myself, so this could be a little bit boring for listeners, but to that extent, first things first, congratulations to you and the New Zealand Initiative on the report. A shout out again to the German New Zealand Chamber of Commerce, who I get to thank for sending me over there twice, and it's pretty hard not to get swept up by that dual training model in its full flourishing as they have in Germany. And as we and many of the people on that last trip last year thought, this is not a drag and drop situation, but there are elements of this training mentality that we can think about what's culturally transferable. And so I think this report has come at a very important time. As I did say in my foreword, what happens to our young people, our own children, the 65,000 or 60,000 or actually declining number of talented young people that are coming into our workforce is always an important issue, and it's well deserving of policy attention. The set of recommendations that you've got, I don't know that I'll go along with all of them, and we'll get there. But in the main, the general thrust, the core of it, the cultural factors around the parity of esteem issue between academic and vocational, or even the very fact that a lot of people think that vocational is the opposite of academic, or from a workforce development perspective, the idea that we focus on 3 out of 10 going to university and 7 out of 10 not going to university, but forgetting that 10 out of 10 are actually on that journey to the workforce, or at least socially and economically, we hope that 100% of them are. I'm in cheeky moments, I like to think about university students not as first years, second years and third years, but as year 14s, year 15s, year 16s. That might just remind us that actually it is all part of that kind of self-same journey into a set of industries that make up our economy with jobs that require lots of qualifications at lots of different levels. That's kind of my framing on the situation. I'll go back a step and say it's been fun. Again, congratulations on the attention that the report release got yesterday. On my own LinkedIn feed, I've seen a number of people that aren't necessarily predisposed to agree with everything the New Zealand Initiative does, going, oh my God, I can't believe I'm agreeing with everything in this report. So I think you've gained some new fans out of it as well, because it isn't particularly ideological to think that we need and our young people need and deserve those clear pathways, that coherence. So look, you've mentioned Arthur Graves. So my next shout out is to the Food and Fibre Centre of Vocational Excellence, because they dug up Arthur and I, who used to be the policy manager and the implementation manager, respectively, around about that youth guarantee time that you spoke about 10 years ago, when the various clutter of schemes. You're quite right, and we concluded equally that what we've got is a situation of tack-ons. With vocational pathways, one of the criticisms we faced early on with that is, look, aren't you pigeonholing students if you send them to, if you encourage them on a construction and infrastructure pathway, or a manufacturing or services industries or primary industries or social, the last thing you can do is pigeonhole kids and cut off their options, because, on a sort of, I think, a false assumption that every child could be everything to everyone. And my response then, and even more strongly now, is no, we are pigeonholing them very much right now as you're a prospective university student until you're not. And if you're not, then you have to go and see an incredibly important person in the school, sometimes in a prefab, sometimes by the cricket nets, got a lot of brochures, and we're going to find something else for you to do. And I've seen in the questions there is, sometimes when in these reports and in these discussions, sometimes you have to simplify to make the point. And people think you're blaming schools. No, I'm not. My thought experiment would be, let's make all the careers advisors the principal for a couple of years and see what happens around the delivery model, particularly around that year 12, 13 space. Because you're right to point out, Michael, that, between STAR and Gateway and 3+2 and trades academies and vocational pathways, there is a really important set of professionals within our secondary system that are trying to make it work and cobbling things together and making lots of phone calls to find relevant, purposeful pathways for young people. But it's all additive. it's not challenging or really rethinking the default model for that senior phase, where, remember, they're allowed to leave school at age 16 altogether, hopefully get a job, are allowed to be paid in that job. So that's why when I look down the set of recommendations that you've made, I find myself just putting a big tick in the box against a few of them. I'm sure when we get into the discussion, we can talk about, I'm not so sure about the bonding. And I'm on board with the idea, particularly of specialising in the high schools as, if you like, a natural consequence of being responsive to their local communities. You've mentioned the busy school. I mean, another of the new charter schools is Hatotipene, the old St. Stephen's, which is definitely setting up in terms of its new curriculum delivery as a bit of a magnet school around primary industries, because that makes sense for where they are in the community that they're in and the occupations and roles and the careers that they'd like to see their graduates get into. So look, I mean, why do all this? And, I mean, this is an issue I've been looking at for a long time, and so I reflect that I haven't solved it. But from that workforce development perspective and the 10 out of 10, I think the way you concluded your remarks is exactly right. Because if our young people are that kind of scarce and declining resource, and they are all, we hope, on a track to a productive and successful transition to the workforce, then actually, yes, we need to create that interface, that sense of progression that Arthur talks about. And that takes change from the way employers think about this situation, not just waiting for the schools to finally get it right one day and send them perfectly prepared end products that can just jump into any job in any firm and be great straight away. It's actually introducing young people in those final 2 years, while they're still attached to the secondary system, to good employers. What do I mean by good employers? The ones that are going to continue to invest in them from a skills perspective. The employers that offer apprenticeships rather than the ones that don't. If that is an important feed into all of our industries, then the very best we can do by those young people is ensure that that education and training will continue on under the guidance of those employers that have kept them engaged in the education system, and now as part of their kind of lifelong learning. So to me, that's, the policy change that's required here is certainly about unbundling what's currently a clutter of schemes into a much more fungible arrangement once we're in year 12 and 13, where the default model is, for sure, if you're going to university, we know how to do that. We've got that recipe in the cookbook of school. We can get you university entrance. But we also are able to establish those partnerships much more easily and within a kind of understood and shared ecosystem between industries, local communities, local employers and schools. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Oliver.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thanks again, Michael. We now have time for the Q&A, and I must say this is an extremely engaged audience. We've got about just under 200 of you online, and you've already lodged 30 questions. We only have about 40 minutes for them, so let's go through them quickly. The top-rated question right now comes from Chris Lind from PWTT Training Consultants, and Chris asks, will there be a turnaround in theoretical training away from unit standards, which only teach students how to re-answer given questions, to purposeful content? Who would like to take that? Michael, maybe?
Yeah, I'll certainly comment on that. I think we need to rethink the NCEA system quite thoroughly, actually. I don't think it's particularly working well either for the trades training route or the university route, to be honest. The problems with the university side are well traversed, but I do think as well that what happens all too often with the unit standard side is that they get used as a kind of grab bag of credits to get kids over the line. And again, it goes to that status issue. They're just not treated as, with respect, to put it perfectly bluntly. Now, we do have the vocational pathways, which are collections of unit standards that are supposed to prepare people, or at least certify that people are prepared to go into a certain apprenticeship or trade or industry area. And maybe, Josh, you'd like to briefly comment on what you think about those vocational pathways.
I'd love to tell a For sure. I'd love to tell a quick story there, because I note the recommendation you've got about establishing a small set of national certificates in industry training.
Yeah.
I flinch at that slightly, but funnily enough, when the vocational pathways were conceived actually by the industry training organisations, it was about the very issue in this question. The ITOs that had set those standards for industry contexts, we're seeing them picked up and used by secondary schools pretty carte blanche, using a magic called base scope accreditation. Sorry for the nerd speak out there. But effectively what this meant was, as Michael's saying, schools were offering great practical options, and fundamentally the NCEA was designed, the mantra literally was multiple pathways. We're getting away from a pass-fail system and you know, the previous assessment system. When you describe it to a young person of today, just want to call the High Court for how deeply unfair it all was. But the NCEA, you know, its greatest strength was its flexibility. You can put together any combination of credits and get the qualification. Its greatest weakness was its flexibility. You can put together any combination of credits and get the qualification. So vocational pathways, I humbly submit, was the best effort after the, you know, we all knew how university entrance was going to work under NCEA, because we asked the Vice Chancellors that, and that's a role that's still protected in the legislation. But vocational pathways were saying, actually, well, what about the other 7 out of 10 students who aren't going there? Or actually the 10 out of 10 students that need to understand how their subject selection is relating to that great big world of work that they're about to go into. So yeah, unit standards and achievement standards. I'd be with you that I think we should just be talking about standards, and we should never forget that this is just about assessing the outcome, as opposed to what's kind of the curriculum delivery and teaching and learning and package of things. Getting to the qualification, and I'll take some blame or credit or either for this, is when the ITO said we should have a small number of industry-facing credentials that school kids can do. I said, no. The NCEA was designed to be a multiple pathways qualification. So what was eventually established was that you can get a vocational pathways award, capital A, just like university entrance is an award. So if you construct your NCEA in a certain way with a certain number of credits from a certain number of approved subjects, that's university entrance. For vocational pathways, we said if the young person has 60 credits that are recommended for an industry and 20 credits related to an industry, and they've ticked the literacy and numeracy box, we'll endorse their NCEA. I think we should have called it a major. If we're talking parity of esteem, I think NCEA with a major in construction and infrastructure would be a lovely thing. Just getting to that parity of esteem issue. And I still probably feel like that's a good approach rather than having new qualifications, because what worries me, Michael, and your report says it, and so did Arthur's and mine, is that only 10% of the kids, as we sit here today, are getting that endorsement on their NCEA. What that implies, given that the vocational pathway recommendations are very broad with respect to curriculum-based achievement standards and industry unit standards, is that grab bag thing is likely happening. We've got kids that are getting NCEA, but it isn't coherent with respect to any particular direction in terms of the workforce. And I think that's the bigger problem.
Okay. Thank you both. The questions are rolling in. We've got 35 questions to go through, so maybe we'll keep the next answers quite brief, except the next question is a fundamental one here. So how do you propose to mitigate the negative reputation of a two-tier system where academic kids are dissuaded from following a vocational pathway? I mean, that's the holy grail of the whole thing, isn't it?
It is. I mean, this idea of parity of esteem, I first heard about it some 20 years ago when I started work at NZQA, where Josh joined me a couple of years later. And even at the time, I thought, I don't think you can probably really manufacture parity of esteem just by having a set of assessment standards and saying that they have equal esteem. It doesn't work like that. As I said in my opening comments, the problem's cultural at root, and you can't change culture by fiat or by legislation or by putting in new rules. But what you can do, and what I think we should do, is to resource things better for the vocational training pathway and make it much more prominent and give it equal status in the system itself, so that And that is why I like the idea of the equivalent to UE, so that there is something clear to aim for that is distinct. And perhaps this is actually, Josh, a disagreement at the level of the kind of knowledge we're talking about. I think that academic knowledge and vocational knowledge and skills are distinct enough to warrant separate recognition. It doesn't mean they're completely distinct, of course, and electricians need physics and builders need mathematics and all of that. I'm not denying that, but I do think that if we recognised them separately, that over time we could build parity of esteem. And if we gave incentives to think about doing that, regardless of your background, we've got to stop seeing it as the repository for kids who are not coping with the academic pathway.
Okay. The next one, it's actually not a question, but an invitation to both of you probably. I invite you to visit Manurewa High School. Successful integration of trades apprenticeship programs, business internships, and flexible timetabling happening there. And I see you're nodding. Michael, you probably know the school?
Yeah. Suspect anonymous, his name is Pete Jones.
Yeah, okay. This will be P-Tech, the collaboration with some big tech firms. Manurewa High School caters to kids who are by and large from fairly disadvantaged backgrounds, and they get them involved in. It's not so much a
question, but it's actually a reminder that some of the stuff is already happening in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, and that's a very good point. But it's patchy, right?
Yeah. What are you doing on April the 13th, Pete? Because that's my next trip up to Auckland, and you're tentatively down with Arthur and I for a case study, because absolutely. And this is the point I was making before about respecting what is happening now. And I think, the things that Michael and Arthur and I have been writing about is you often feel that you get your hair huffing and puffing sometimes because you're oversimplifying the situation to make a point. Of course, there's magnificent pockets of innovation out there that point the way for others, but most importantly need to be adopted as a systematic response rather than something that a very passionate school and very passionate people have put together from whatever they've been able to cobble together, and through what's often, in my observation, that the right kind of input from outside the school too. The community, the employers, the local economy, a partnership's been formed, an arrangement has been struck that is really providing incredibly relevant, purposeful, keeping kids engaged. I hear about the 3-bedroom houses being built on the school grounds that isn't just teaching young people hammers and nails and isn't just happening on Friday afternoon, but is from the consenting process all the way through the supply chain of how you deliver a house to a section and put in the infrastructure. It's magnificent. So I do not want to diminish what goes on, but
not all schools are like that. And we've got the next question here is actually asking, why do New Zealand schools persist in promoting university pathways when our youth unemployment data clearly favors vocational training?
I think it's an historical legacy, and it's a kind of cycle, because university education, it kind of starts with what the curriculum is based on. As I said before, most of the school subjects in the New Zealand curriculum are derived from university disciplines. And so schools employ teachers that can teach those disciplines, and that's what yields the qualifications that are valued, and so it goes round. It's very hard to break that cycle of overly esteeming the university qualifications.
Could there be another factor? Because there's another question actually going in this direction. Teacher training, of course, moved from teacher colleges to universities in the 2000s, and that was followed then by drops in PISA ratings. Is there a risk to trade training from this unification pressure?
I'll give that one to Josh to answer. I certainly have some views about teacher education.
Yeah, I know. I do too, and I think it's actually a great space for apprenticeships. Let's imagine that every teacher aide in New Zealand classrooms was in fact an apprentice teacher, and we had a classroom first approach. I know that is an area that there is a program and that's expanding, and I'm gratified to see it. I think it's a slightly different question though, but it's definitely not a new issue. It's what Michael said. Again, we don't blame teachers for the fact that they themselves have been teacher trained and gone back into classrooms where since at least 1969 and before, pick 6 subjects, pens and pencils, timetable, exam, classroom-based education, because it's a practice for an academic pathway. What's happened with retention, and now more and more of our young people staying through to 13 years, is that the clientele at the restaurant has entirely changed, but the menu at the restaurant hasn't changed. It's still, as I said before, you're pigeonholed as we're practicing for university until proven otherwise, and that I think does lead, to quite long-standing stuff. I mean, my gosh, I'm lucky enough now to have worked with vocational training system for a long time, and those professional qualified tradespeople have got plenty going on upstairs, but the formal education system told them that they didn't. And that's, I think, another cultural factor here. I pay attention very closely. Michael said the average apprentice is 28. What I look at is the prior attainment, and what we saw, particularly when I was with the Industry Training Federation, was increasing numbers of degree qualified and certificate and diploma qualified people that already done something in tertiary education to quite a high level, then coming into industry training and apprenticeships. I'm not going to say that's terribly wrong, but I do notice that we always say that their earnings potential was their highest qualification, not their most recent qualification. And actually, if we look at their pathway, the reason that apprentice is 28 is that our system has been making people do school and then more tertiary education and then workforce, rather than what I think would benefit many, many more of our young people is what we're talking about, that a blurry interface ecosystem in the final 2 years of high school that take a workplace first approach. That's Germany, because 20% of Germany's employers are absorbing every year half of the school leavers into a blended pathway of company-based and college-based learning, which is also an answer, by the way, for our polytechnic sector.
We've got one question here about the best age to start putting students onto apprenticeship pathways. Is there any evidence as to the best age for students to decide on which pathway they should go? And is year 11 too young?
I don't think there's any hard evidence. I certainly wouldn't think that we should go down the German track here where they branch them at the age of 10. That wouldn't fly culturally, and I'm not sure that it would be a good idea even if it did. My view is that at the moment we have the final 3 years of secondary school as the kind of post-compulsory curriculum years. And so that's a good first cut of where to do it. I can certainly hear an argument that it should be year 12 rather than year 11 though.
Josh?
I think, adding on, making sure that employability, practicing for going to work and gaining those experiences, just exposure, even if it's a sector you think you might want to explore, and you go in and you find out that that's not what you want. These are all very good things to be doing in the final 2 years of secondary school.
Okay, so if it's year 11, next question, then are there any thoughts on a generic trades program for year 11 so that students understand all trade opportunities so they can then select an apprenticeship that meets their interests and strengths?
I love that. And that was, yeah.
You go, Josh.
You go, Michael. Oh, sure. So vocational pathways, again, when we were thinking about that, 10 plus years ago, year 11 did look there, particularly around at that point, level 2, certainly the evidence was showing was that gateway qualification, if you like, to a successful future. And so back at year 11, if it were possible, and of course we kept hearing about the timetable, but that try before you buy, I think a rotational scheme where, by the end of the year, again, it's we've got OECD research around this, and most people intuitively recall the time they went on a field trip. They don't remember every science class, and so the opportunity to meet employers in different industries, even if it's quite short term. So, it is case by case. I think that's important, but it can be genericized a bit. Like year 11 is have a taste of all of the pathways. Year 12. Pick one of your subjects, get 20 credits, like a gateway in the pathway of your choice. And then year 13, we're going to be spending 3 days a week in school and 2 days in paid employment in that sector, handing over into an apprenticeship.
That last question was asked by Lee Gray, by the way, who had another follow-up question on this. Have you considered what needs to happen in the junior schools so they have the time and space in the curriculum to explore options and understand pathways?
Yeah, I mean, I think the junior, I'm probably more conservative here. I think the primary school really needs to focus on the core skills of literacy and numeracy. I mean, it hasn't actually been doing very well in that regard for the last 20 years, and we're seeing some fairly shocking stats about the literacy and numeracy skills of our young people, and that's fundamental. And I also think that the focus on subjects derived from university disciplines is quite justified earlier on, not because everyone's going to become a scientist or an historian, but because these are the things that do build knowledge about the world and critical thinking skills and give it opportunities to learn to write and those kinds of really fundamental things. So I am more conservative when it comes to especially primary school, but also the first couple of years of high school.
Okay. Next question then. What are your suggested strategies to influence the primary influencers, in inverted commas, of young people, that is, their parents, to promote vocational versus university pathways?
I'll challenge the premise of the question again in terms of vocational versus university. And this is why, I don't think this is a hand-wringing response to your report or kind of, but as I say, I would love to see schools that are specialising in particular pathways, for instance, but not if that means that they're precluded from university entrance. I don't like that hard binary between you're either a university or you're a vocational. Coming back to the point that, I frame it this way: if we look at the construction and infrastructure vocational pathway, we have labourers and we have hammer hands, but we also have qualified carpenters and we have site supervisors, but we've also got the architect that designed the thing, and you'll need a degree for that. So I think these, this is, I know the questions keep changing in terms of the top ranking one, but like that parity of esteem thing for me. See, vocational pathways got called vocational, and that immediately met the mindset of non-university. It wasn't. In fact, it was quite inclusive to the extent that we included and mapped all of the careers on the Careers New Zealand website, including all of the roles that typically require a degree. We tried to frame it from workforce sectors as opposed to academic versus vocational, but we called them vocational, and therefore we met the mindset. So the question was about mums and influencers. Absolutely. One quick win: the UK, the Americans, the Canadians, the Scottish, the Australians, all have a version of a National Skills Week or a National Apprenticeships Week, which really celebrates the fact that here's the ducks of the school, but he also went on Gateway. Just those celebration of success and acknowledgement and seeing the success. I think I recall a few years ago with the ITF, we caught some attention with some research which Burl undertook, showing that the net outcome between the apprentice and the university graduate was about the same in terms of the balance sheet of life by age 65. So I think if we can get out there that, this is not a second option, it is not a bad thing at all to be more practically wired or not wanting to at least immediately follow an academic pathway immediately post school.
So that's how to reach
chip away at it.
Family influencers, parents. Another question is actually how to reach policymakers, because that's the next question here. Many interesting ideas and possibilities in the report, but what's the plan forward to move these ideas forward and develop these ideas and influence the policymakers? Michael, you might have some observations on that, because...
Well, I have to say that I was very honoured that Minister Simmons was at the launch last evening, and I saw her sitting in the front row with a big smile on her face, and in fact she was inspired to jump up at the end and really endorse the report. So I think we have got some traction there. I'm very hopeful that we'll have some further conversations. So, I mean, policy change is always...
Just one question to that, because we had similar discussions in the past with Chris Hipkins when he was Education Minister, and I know that Labour is equally in favour of parity of esteem. So this is not a part.
I mean, that's a really good point, right? This should be ripe ground for bipartisanship on policy. There should be nothing for either side of politics to object to in this kind of thinking.
Josh, agree?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, it's one of the lovely things about working in this space, along with the satisfaction of trying to support young people to find their own future success and prosperity. Is, I've met with and worked with ministers of all stripes, and I've yet to meet one who doesn't think that we should have young people well prepared with good relevance and purpose and sense of direction post school, because that their successful career is our successful society, economy, country.
Okay, so in the last couple of questions, we talked about parents, we talked about policymakers. Next question then is, how do you engage with the secondary sector? Can you actually convince the secondary sector to change their ways and be a bit more open-minded about the outcomes?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much a matter of convincing them as resourcing them and setting them up with the right incentives and the right kind of support. As Josh said, we don't want to be blaming the schools. They do what they're funded to do, and they do what the incentives are there to do. And when the students and parents are valuing UE, that's what they aim for. So I really like Josh's idea. He's pointed out that other countries have these weeks where everybody gets to celebrate the apprenticeship pathways and just make it more visible, and also put in, as I said before, I think the new industry skills board should be given a brief to support the secondary schools in developing their programs and improving them and helping to connect them with industry, and we should make dual training easier so that young people can enroll at a school and a tertiary institution at the same time. So there are systems level things that we can do to make this a lot easier for schools, and I think that's how we should frame that.
Well, there's one question here. Could students be in industry training and then be 3 days at school? I mean, that is the dual model that Germany has.
Yeah.
I mean, only question is really at what age could it start? But let's take another one, maybe a more psychological question for you then, Michael, as a psychologist. What psychological barriers prevent New Zealand from achieving this parity of esteem? Is there something in our national psyche maybe that hasn't led us down that path? Or is this actually something not just happening in New Zealand, but worldwide?
I think the disparity of esteem isn't just a New Zealand thing. You'll certainly find it in Australia too, even in Germany a little bit, but not nearly to the same degree. And so I do think there is something in our national psyche. Exactly what it is, I don't really know. It may have to do with our kind of the European forebears and which countries they came from and their attitudes. But it's kind of hard to know where that attitude came from, but it's there. And I think it is worse than it is in a lot of other countries.
I think it's pretty astonishing that we spend 13 years of school. Remember, this isn't just year 12 and 13, this is year 1 to 13, and at least an equivalent number of billions of dollars, only to get to the sharp end of that situation and be so focused on university entrance, which is a 3 out of 10 story, and actually then 5 years later, 1.5 of them have got the degree. I mean, that does seem like an extraordinary situation to me if we're thinking about what all of this education is for and about. Yes, absolutely, it's a great thing to go to university. I did, Michael did. I mean, and it opened doors, and it certainly will get you into a different set of interview rooms, but it's not how the workforce is made up. And here's the other thing, and I want to get to this. I mean, that the common entrance standard, which is the technical term for university entrance, is a little bit unusual in New Zealand, especially for the fact that it's gone by age 20. So imagine that 13 years and all those billions, that entire compulsory school process leading up and so focused on an option that matters for 18 months in the life of that child.
Next question, perhaps for you, Michael. Why have trade academies failed to normalize dual enrollment as mainstream educational practice?
Well, actually, I think that's probably something that Josh knows a lot more about, but I think...
I want this one. Yeah, I'll keep it brief.
Sorry, you go for it, Josh.
So, and I actually said this, I think, in my foreword. We've got a legislative enablement already since 2010 around dual enrolment. It's a bit bureaucratic. The Secretary for Education has to approve a lead provider and approve a secondary tertiary program. But those are bureaucratic choices about how you implement. And the way we've implemented it is to have a number of trades academies. There's about 20-something if you unbundle Te Pukenga, and 14 of them if you count Te Pukenga all as one trades academy. But basically, we've capped and trapped the dual enrolment opportunity within a scheme called Trades Academies, and I'd throw Gateway in there too. And just by the way, and I think Michael's report makes this point very well. There's about 85 million in fees-free 1 and 2 youth guarantee. There's over 100 million now in the Trades Academies scheme. There's another 35 plus 25 if you put together Star and Gateway. And then if you just look at sort of a student place around year 12 and 13, well, I reckon we're knocking on $500 million a year that could basically be put into this much more flexible and fungible, let's have a program that involves you being at school 3 days a week and at work 2 days a week, or other kinds of combinations too. This also goes to the notion around paying the students while they're in the workplace. I'm not sure every employer will chomp at the bit to do it, but it ought to at least be enabled. I was a bit struck in the research Arthur and I did talking to Trades Academy coordinators who talked about the fact that they would meet their students after hours working security at the supermarket because they're needing to earn money to help support the family. Well, why on earth could they not be getting funded for the 2 days a week they're in a Gateway program?
I'll just mention that we've run many webinars before, but we've never had so many questions. We've already asked 18, we've got 34 left, and we've got 9 minutes for all of these questions. So there is a lot to talk about. There is a lot of interest in the reports, which is fantastic. Let's see how many we'll get through. One question is from Nick Hackett at Massey High, asking, could students be paid for the 2 days for an industry training and then be in school for 3 days? Again, this is the German system. Do you think it would work here?
Well, that Josh just mentioned that, and I think yes. I mean, we've got this bizarre law that says that school students can't be paid if they do work integrated learning, and again, as Josh said, perhaps they might not be desperate. Employers might not be desperate to pay them, but it should at least be an option, and we should develop a culture of doing that, and then you start to get that kind of more smooth transition from school to the workplace if we see the work integrated learning part as actual work.
Does it take a legislative change?
No, it doesn't. No, I've got good news. Minister Simmons, it's a line in the ministerial instruction to the TEC that just forbids kids from being paid while on Gateway. I do not know the policy rationale for that. I don't think there is one.
Okay, Penny Simmons, if you're listening, this is what you have to do. 2 questions maybe together from Chris Lind. Will schools be given funding to build newly equipped technical blocks with modern equipment, and will a degree type qualification be available to provide parity between trades and academia?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, like how to resource this. And I think it's probably more efficient rather than having every school install a whole lot of technical equipment to enable dual enrolment a lot of the time, where that technical work is actually done at a tertiary institution. If you think of the range of what is it, Josh, about 250 apprenticeships possible, that'd be an awful lot of kit that schools would need to support. So I think practically it's better to probably do that side of things more at the tertiary dual enrolment end, and have the secondary schools do some training, but also focus on things like work readiness and literacy and numeracy and some of the other things that the young people need to pursue their pathway of choice.
Okay, we can take the next 2 questions together as well, because one question is looking at NCEA. Why has NCEA failed in its mission to create parity for STEAM for vocational pathways? And then the next question says, nothing in this discussion is new. We fail to listen to learners in industry. What can be done to get the voice of learners in industry in this conversation? So if I take the 2 together, what they tell me is actually this was the whole purpose of NCEA, to get us towards that kind of future. It didn't work. We seem to be having these discussions regularly. Every 10 years or so, somebody says, oh, look at Germany or Switzerland, look at what they're doing there. Then perhaps somebody builds a working group within the Ministry of Education, and then nothing happens until 10 years ago. We have this Eureka moment and the same discussion again. What convinces you that your report will not trigger something that isn't quite like that?
Well, I mean, it's depressingly true that we've been here before. On the NCEA side, I'd say what I would have said 20 years ago, which is that you can't manufacture parity of esteem by changing the assessment system. You have to change the systems that sit behind it and the learning that leads to the assessment, and really make much more visible the pathways that at the moment don't have parity of esteem. It's not an easy task. What makes me think that this will be more effective? Well, look, you know, my report alone won't do it, but, you know, Josh and Arthur have written a really good report as well. There are other good thinkers out there thinking along these lines. We do have an opportunity with the redevelopment of the workforce development councils. We do have an opportunity with the rethinking of the curriculum and with NCEA. I don't know that we'll get all the way there, but let's push as hard as we can and see where we do get.
Well, next one. What initiatives will be put in place to attract competent teaching staff from the trades to pass on competent technical knowledge? That's a question from Chris Lind, by the way.
Yeah, so I mean, gosh, there is some industrial stuff here, of course, in terms of collective agreements and the pay scales that apply in terms of how the ministry pays teachers. Having said that, I do know, and actually, again, to the recommendation, if we were essentially to consolidate all of those schemes that we currently have around vocational education, that I believe would create quite a lot of resource. And I know this does occur, and actually the busy school is a good example of this too, in terms of, you know, ultimately if you can come to an arrangement with the tertiary provider, you know, there's the school and who's around in terms of the local employers and the local tertiary providers that can provide that resource, but also that expertise. And I am aware, and I know Manurewa, when we go and visit, there are people that are coming in. All the kids are going out. We can make that work in terms of more of this kind of multi-provider situation around delivering a program of learning, which again, I think goes right back to just what Michael was just saying. Ultimately here, this was an assessment system, but it's been grafted onto the existing paradigm of discipline-based, subject-based, how we run a high school, how we've run high schools forever. And it struggles to get out of its own way. And I'm with Michael. I think that makes sense, year 9 and 10. What we know, though, is that the deliberate effects of literacy and numeracy teaching must not stop at the end of primary school for anybody that still faces that as an issue. Same goes aged 55. If that's still the issue, that's the intervention required. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, the employers and trainers ought to be able to come much more easily onto school grounds. An earlier part of the conversation here, a bit like the blaming schools, it's not like only the schools have to change. There is very much a mindset that more employers need to be aware and open and willing to fling open their doors on Thursdays and Fridays to have some younger people, younger than they've been used to employing, to come in, because actually that will benefit the industry in the longer run.
Okay, we might have time for one final question, but it's a really good one. It's coming from Ines Roberts at the Auckland Chamber of Commerce, asking, industry also needs to become youth ready. In Germany, businesses who train apprentices also receive training to mentor the youth, but who mentors the mentors? Who mentors the trainers in New Zealand?
That's a really
can I take a tiny part of it and I'll hand over to Michael? Because yes, I mean, clearly the reason that training is in the DNA of German companies is because in order to own a German company or run one, you have to have a qualification which includes the ability to train. If you want to own a company, you have to learn how to train, or if you own a company, you know how to train. That is what has developed the situation where 50% of the school leavers are happily being absorbed into the industry straight out of school. That I just wanted to pick on.
Yeah, I think that's right. We need to cast the tradesperson career as not just the trade itself, but also moving into a training role and seeing that as a high status thing to do, as the Germans do, and as an essential part of things that, you know, there is a legacy to hand on. So that again is a cultural thing that the Germans very much have, a sense of responsibility to their vocation, to their trade. But I think if we had a really strong focus on master level qualifications for tradespeople, which entailed good remuneration, but also respect, and that this is an important part of a career pathway and not just something that you do at the very end of your career when you're kind of winding down, that would instill much more vibrancy into the training sector. And I think the question of the companies, and for that matter, the tertiary institutions being youth ready, is a very, very good way to put it.
And that brings us to the end of the webinar. I want to thank Josh Williams and Michael Johnston for your contributions. I want to thank everybody online, and you kept your audience. We went through 25 questions. We've got 31 questions left. I encourage everyone to just send in the questions to Michael and Josh. You will find their email addresses easily, and we'll try our best to answer them. But in any case, I remind you again, the report, of course, Trade Rules, is on our website. We hope it will inform the debate. We believe it will not be the last report on this, and we are hopeful that there is enough bipartisanship to finally move this forward, because it's been tried for decades, and now is the time to really get cracking on this and actually make it happen. But for now, thanks again, Josh. Thanks, Michael. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.